Somewhere in the southeastern jungle of Sri Lanka, there is an international airport with a runway long enough to land a Boeing 747, a terminal that can process 1 million passengers a year, and a 23-foot golden statue of a Buddhist deity watching over an arrivals hall that on most days nobody arrives into. For years, this airport served an average of 7 passengers a day, not 7 planes, 7 people. At its emptiest, 1 departure a week left the ground. The rest of the time, the building sat still. Air conditioning running, lights on, staff on shift, waiting for travellers who weren't coming. At one point, part of the terminal was repurposed to store sacks of rice, because an airport, it turns out, makes a very expensive warehouse. This is Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport, and its story isn't really about an airport at all. It's about what happens when a national infrastructure decision gets made for one man's hometown pride instead of one country's transportation needs. And what happens when the money to build it comes from a lender who was never worried about whether the airport would work, because the debt was the point. Part 1. The idea. To understand why this airport exists, you have to understand where it exists. Hambantota is a fishing town on Sri Lanka's southern coast. Small, rural, and, until the early 2000s, mostly known for salt pans and a wildlife-rich stretch of coastline nearby. It is also the hometown of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who became president of Sri Lanka in 2005 and would go on to lead the country through the final brutal end of its decades-long civil war in 2009. Victory in that war gave Rajapaksa enormous political capital, and he decided to spend a chunk of it transforming Hambantota into what he envisioned as Sri Lanka's second economic hub, a rival to the congested capital Colombo on the other side of the island. The plan was sweeping: a deep-water seaport, a cricket stadium built to international standards, a convention centre, and an international airport, all clustered around a town that, at the time, had none of the population, tourism infrastructure, or air traffic demand to justify any of them. The airport alone was projected to eventually cost over $1 billion in ambition, though its first phase came in at a comparatively modest $209 million. Of that, $190 million came as a loan from the Export-Import Bank of China, part of a much larger pattern of Chinese state financing for Sri Lankan infrastructure during the Rajapaksa years, and a detail that would matter enormously later. The site chosen for the airport was 18 kilometres from Hambantota's town centre, in the middle of an elephant migration corridor and a route used by dozens of species of migratory birds. Sri Lanka's own Strategic Enterprises Management Agency had recommended against building an international airport here at all, suggesting instead that the government simply expand the existing airport in Colombo. That recommendation was overruled. Part 2. The opening. Mattala Rajapaksa. International Airport opened on March 18, 2013, with President Rajapaksa and a full slate of dignitaries arriving aboard a Sri Lankan Airlines flight for the inauguration. The airport was designed with a single main runway just over 11,000 feet long, 12 check-in counters, and a terminal building of over 100,000 square feet. Built, government officials said, to eventually handle 1 million passengers and 50,000 tons of cargo annually by 2028. For a brief window, there were real flights. Sri Lankan Airlines set up a hub operation, routing passengers through Mattala on their way to destinations like Bangkok, Beijing, and Riyadh. Budget carrier Air Arabia began flying in from Sharjah. On opening week, the airport's 7 daily flights were reportedly full. The fullness didn't last. Air Arabia pulled out after just 6 weeks, citing low demand. Passenger projections had assumed the airport would draw over 160,000 travellers in its first full year. It handled around 36,000. The following year's target was even higher, over 171,000, and the airport managed roughly 40,000. By June 2015, after a change in government ended what officials described as artificial efforts to inflate the numbers, monthly passenger traffic had fallen below 5,000 people. Sri Lankan Airlines shut down its Mattala hub entirely in January of that year, citing unsustainable losses on every route it flew from there. Part 3. Why nobody came. The failure wasn't really a mystery, and in hindsight, most of the reasons were foreseeable before a single foundation was poured. Hambantota, for all its political significance, simply didn't have what an international airport needs to survive: a resident population large enough to generate outbound demand, tourist attractions dense enough to pull inbound travellers, or commercial infrastructure, hotels, restaurants, transport links, to support either. One economist later put it simply: without those things, it's structurally impossible for the airlines serving you to stay profitable, no matter how nice your terminal is. There were also basic engineering problems. Aviation experts flagged that the runway's orientation left aircraft exposed to dangerous crosswinds. The airport had only a single taxiway, forcing pilots to make full 180-degree turns on the runway itself during takeoff and landing. A design flaw that limited how many flights the airport could realistically handle, even if demand had existed. Sri Lankan pilots, notably, were never consulted during the planning process. And then there was distance. Mattala sat roughly 3 hours by road from many of the attractions it was supposed to serve as a gateway to, including Yala National Park. Passengers who did land often found themselves facing a long, unglamorous transfer through rural roads to reach anywhere worth visiting. Hardly the seamless arrivals experience an international airport is supposed to offer. Part 4. The bill comes due. While passenger numbers collapsed, the airport's costs did not. It had to remain staffed and operational around the clock, regardless of how many, or how few, flights used it. Reported income for the airport was around $300,000 in 2013 and roughly $830,000 the following year. Against that, running costs, salaries, maintenance, electricity, water ran to over $13 million in 2014 and nearly $18 million in 2015. At one stretch, the airport was reportedly losing around $18 million a year, while interest on the Chinese loan financing it ran to roughly $17 million annually. The airport, in other words, was losing money at almost exactly the rate the loan used to build it was costing to service. This is where Mattala's story connects to a much bigger and more consequential one. The Hambantota development plan wasn't just an airport. It was a seaport too, costing over $1 billion, also financed heavily through Chinese loans. When Sri Lanka found itself unable to keep up with the debt these projects generated, the government eventually handed a 99-year lease on the Hambantota port itself to a Chinese state-owned company in 2017, a deal that became one of the most widely cited case studies of what critics call debt trap infrastructure financing, where a lender extends financing for a project of dubious commercial viability and takes a strategic asset in exchange when the borrower can't pay. Whether Mattala Airport and the broader Hambantota project were designed with that outcome in mind, or simply turned out that way through bad planning, remains genuinely disputed among economists and foreign policy analysts. But the practical result was the same either way. A small nation had traded away control of a strategic port, largely because of infrastructure that never generated the revenue it needed to. Part 5. The afterlife. Mattala never fully closed. It has instead spent more than a decade as a kind of infrastructure ghost, occasionally reactivated, mostly dormant. Successive Sri Lankan governments have floated plan after plan to revive it, turning it into an aircraft storage and maintenance hub, a flight training school, a logistics park tied to the nearby port. In 2018, officials considered handing management to an Indian company amid political anxiety about ceding yet more strategic infrastructure to foreign control. In 2024, the government struck a deal to lease the airport to a joint Indian-Russian consortium for 30 years. As of the most recent plans, the vision has shifted again, away from passenger flights altogether, toward repositioning Mattala as an aviation industrial and logistics estate, rather than the international gateway it was originally sold as. None of these plans has yet turned Mattala into anything resembling what it was built to be. The lesson. What makes Mattala such a clean case study isn't just the scale of the waste, it's how predictable the failure was at every single decision point. The demand data didn't support it, the location didn't support it, the government's own internal experts said as much before construction began. And yet, the project moved forward anyway, because the decision wasn't really being driven by passenger economics. It was being driven by political symbolism, a president building a legacy project in the town where he grew up, and by a foreign lender that had every incentive to say yes. Which raises the question this channel is going to keep coming back to. How many billion-dollar mistakes are really mistakes at all, versus decisions where the people approving them were never the people who'd bear the cost of getting it wrong? If you think a government can waste a fortune on a building nobody uses, wait until you see what a $1 trillion tech company managed to waste on a pair of glasses. That's next.